Hi, my name is Jay Burney, and welcome to Birds of the Niagara. Myself and Marcie Jacklin. I'm the U.S. co-chair of Birds of the Niagara, and Marcie Jacklin is one of the Canada co-chairs of Birds of the Niagara. And we're going to talk to you a little bit about some development threats, conservation threats that are in the corridor. And so we'll go right into this presentation. So our program title, and it's mostly going to be Marcie, is called Conserving Critical Places in the Niagara River and Saving Waverly Woods, which is an important place that we all need to know more about. And so this is Marcie and Jay. I am, as I mentioned earlier, the co-chair, the U.S. co-chair of Birds in the Niagara, and Marcie is one of the Canada co-chairs. I also work with the Pollinator Conservation Association. I'm the special projects director there. So I want to talk about location. We're in a pretty special place. We're in the Great Lakes. Great Lakes contains 20% of the world's fresh surface water, and we're between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. By we, I mean the Niagara River Corridor, and both Marcie and I do a lot of work right on the edge of the Lake Erie and the Niagara River. And so the map on the left shows you basically the Niagara River going from Lake Ontario to the top and Lake Erie on the bottom. And the map on the right shows a little closer, and it shows some of the green areas and some of the industrial areas and some of the urbanized areas that are not quite as green. This is where we are, and we're going to be talking about the Lake Erie end of this map. The map on the left is a map that is used by a lot of organizations and people of the Niagara River globally significant important bird area. It's a very narrow map, and it's just one of many maps that people use. And the map on the right is the one that I've been using for years just to kind of describe the green corridor that we want to talk about. It's not just the IBA. There's a lot of other things that are in there too, but it's a green corridor. And it stretches from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario. And although Marcie, and there's a little more emphasis in this map on the right, on the American side, that's because I've only started working with you in the last 4 or 5 years, and I've been using this map for about 10 years. So I apologize for not having more green on the Canada side, but you'll see this is going to change even tonight. This is a map that Birds Canada uses to describe the IBA. And the unusual thing about this is that the Niagara River Corridor in this map doesn't even include Grand Island or the other side of the Niagara River on the other side of Grand Island towards the US side. What is really neat about this map is it shows other important bird and biodiversity areas that we're all connected to. So the IBA maps have some stories behind them. I've been working on this stuff for a long time, and the truth is that these maps have political stories. And the politics are basically based on economic politics. Political boundaries that are created on these maps are not necessarily natural boundaries. They're not necessarily the maps that are used by nature or by the birds or by other wildlife and biodiversity. They're political boundaries. And again, the concept is based on economic politics. What that means is that it's kind of driven by development. And so the economic politics are you can have a conservation area, but as long as it doesn't impact on economic development. And that's a real problem. Economic development drives a lot of our conservation strategies. So while these maps address the environment to a certain extent, the bottom line is that it's an economic-based map. It's an economic-based concept. It's not environmentally driven and it's not socially driven. It's development driven. Conservation strategies are often driven by economics as the bottom line. We all know that environmental investments are significantly superior to sprawl and development relative to public benefit. How does that work in a globally significant IBA, in a Ramsar wetland of international significance, which is what we are in the Niagara River Corridor? Clearly here, it has its foundations in conventional economic politics. And that means that it considers the environment as an externality. And what that means is that when you measure the profit, you don't measure the costs to the environment. You don't measure the social cost to the community. So for example, if you you're taking lumber out, you measure the value of that lumber and the profit of that value based on the board feet and how much that's worth. You don't measure it on the value of the forest. And so that's the externality. You don't measure the real cost. You just measure the benefit. You sell the board lumber, you make a profit. That's good. What does it cost by destroying the forest? We don't measure that. That's our conventional economics. That's how we do things. David Suzuki called that kind of conventional economic thinking brain damage, and he makes a good case. So, sustainability, resiliency are two topics that we think about when we talk about conservation and conservation ethics and how we really want to measure the value of something. And both sustainability and resiliency talk about the relationships between social, economic, and environment. And most of us think that the environment should always be the bottom line. It never is. So, the primary threat to conservation is inappropriate development. We have constant threats. We have new threats. We have legacy threats. And one of the biggest threats we're facing now, besides development and all the other things, the legacy threats, climate change. Climate change is here and it's changing everything that we do, and it has to change the way that we think. We have to have a conservation ethic, not driven exclusively by conventional economics and conventional development. Birds in the Niagara is an example of how we can start to think differently about that. We think about ecotourism, and so we start to think about economic development through the lens of conservation. Ecotourism is one of the fastest growing industry and biggest industries in the whole world. We have an abundance of ability here to bring people in to do that kind of tourism. And how do we do that? Conservation. Develop a conservation ethic, because if we build things here, if we protect things here, we're going to get people that come here to see what we have and to invest here, work here, live here. Birds in Niagara does that. And this year, our event talks a lot about how we can do better development through the lens of conservation. We can choose to do good things, things that make economic sense. We can provide a better place for future generations if we develop this conservation ethic. Go back to some maps. This is another way of looking at the IBA. It's a little bit wider of a map. The truth is, how do we define what the IBA is? Biodiversity? How do we characterize boundaries? Science? Do we use science? We didn't use science in the sense that we really need to develop better scientific analysis of the IBA to see how birds use it, where they use it, what birds use it, when they use it. Political boundaries don't matter to birds. So we need an international conservation plan. So we need to invest in research that will help us to know more about this Niagara River Corridor and what really is the IBA. It'll help us to make better and more cost-effective investments. The more we know, the better decisions we can make. So climate change is really something that we have to continue to think about and make decisions based on knowledge of. And there's a lot of things that are happening every day, every week, every year that make this more important. We have increasingly powerful storms. We have high lake levels, and these things change humanity's ability to live along the shoreline. What are the classic definitions of sustainability and resiliency? The interaction between culture, economics, and environment, with environment is the bottom line. Appropriate development, what is that? It recognizes social and cultural justice. It recognizes that economic investments that benefit the local economy are more appropriate than ones that are extractive. And it also recognizes, as the bottom line, environmental integrity. This is another way of looking at the IBA. This is a wider view. Again, we don't have enough science to really know what the IBA is, but I like to look at it bigger. And if we have to make it smaller, we'll do it based on the science. Political boundaries don't work. And we have a lot of political boundaries in the Niagara River Corridor: international boundaries, community boundaries, county boundaries. What are the natural boundaries? We don't know. I work a lot, Marcie works a lot on the Lake Erie end of the IBA, and this map on the right shows on the far right the Buffalo Outer Harbor, and on the left where Waverly Woods is. And that's basically where Waverly Woods is, and that's basically where the Outer Harbor is. And so the work that Marcie and I do is very comparable. The work I do on my shoreline is similar to the work she does in her shoreline. The threats are the same. The threats of development are the same. Inappropriate development threats are the same. One of the things that we think about in the Outer Harbor is nature. We think that in Buffalo, it's publicly owned parkland, and this is where we work on this place that is a nature preserve. There's grasslands, there's forests, there's sand barrens. Um, this is a very special place on Buffalo's Outer Harbor. It's just across from downtown. It's a really beautiful green place. A few years ago, a group of developers came up with a plan to develop the Outer Harbor, to do something different. And this just kind of landed on my desk one day, and it blew me away to see how they were transforming Times Beach down in the bottom left, for instance, and the whole area just turning into a new condo village, 1,000 acres of condos. It's classic sprawl, and sprawl is known economically to bankrupt communities. So it doesn't make economic sense either, but they would argue this is good economy, good economic development, but it's not. We are relying and have relied to address these issues with activism. One day after this original plan came up, a developer proposed this building next to Times Beach. We ended up having a lot of public meetings, protests. We had media coverage. We didn't want these condos to go on that because we knew it would do harm. We did press conferences, uh, numbers of press conferences. We had political leaders that came and help us. We did public meetings. And the ultimate result was pretty positive because about a year ago, just as the pandemic was starting, the developer said, no, we're not going to do this building. We were in court with the developer. It was very expensive, but we basically, at this point, have won. He's not building that building, and we're trying to do something else there. We're trying to purchase the property. That's the only private property. We're trying to purchase it, make it part of a state park. We've done more than protest. We've published reports. We want to do a park. We want the state to own the park out there, and we're pushing that. We think it's a great idea. We've done other kinds of reports on the cultural landscape. We've really made this a place other than something that people should just think of as a condo village that is for rich people. We also do a lot of education. We bring people out to the Outer Harbor. We show them the beauty. We show them the nature. We show them the value of a green space as opposed to a privatized development. And we bird watch. You know, this is the Outer Harbor in Buffalo, just like Waverly Woods is an incredibly important place and neat place to watch birds. And we do citizen science. A lot of great stuff out there. A lot of stuff that we would lose to development. We even build places. We build garden walks. We build beach paths. We plant native areas, native plants for pollinators. And we also have great partnerships with our friends. This is a picture of Marcie and Carrie Kennedy, who are the two co-chairs from the Canada side. This is one of the plans that we've thought about instead of the sprawling condos. Let's build these grasslands. Let's build these scrublands. Let's build some shorebird features. There's a lot of need for that kind of conservation ethic. So we're promoting this stuff. We're pushing this stuff. We're working with the various elements that control the development out there to make sure that we can do something important. It's not easy. It's a constant fight. And we have a lot to lose. This is a great time to be doing this kind of work. And I know that it's the same kind of uh, threats that Marcie is facing on the other side, just across the lake. And I'm going to let Marcie talk to you about Waverly Woods now. Marcie, who is Brock University for 25 years and is an avid bird watcher for 30 years or more, and is a great activist on the Canada side and helps us on the American side too. Thanks for letting me introduce you.
Thanks, Jay. That was an awesome introduction, and I know we share a lot of the same problems, but also hopes. So I'm let me get started with my show. Um, I just want to start with this video because sometimes it's easier to explain an area by seeing it. And this happened to be a migratory day at Waverly Woods. And it really was a great experience for everybody that was there. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the beauty of the land and its birding hotspots. I'd like to acknowledge the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, and I apologize for my pronunciations, people who have lived here forever. I'd like to acknowledge the mass displacement of the people that has taken place in the territory. And I'd like to acknowledge the absence of the peoples and wonder why they are scattered in four directions. So Waverly Woods, as Jay pointed out, is just across the lake or river, depending on where you are, from Buffalo. We're very close. The indigenous people lived in this area, Waverly in particular, for 4,000 years before the arrival of non-indigenous people. And they always went by the dish with one spoon treaty, which the dish represents that the land is to be shared peacefully, and the spoon represents individuals living on and using the resources of the land, use it in a spirit of mutual cooperation. So I'm going to continue with a brief history of Waverly Woods. So when settlers began arriving in this area in the 1700s, very early in the time frame of Canada, the original fort was actually located right on the river, but it only lasted about 40 years because they weren't anticipating the powerful storms on Lake Erie. It's also a gathering place of sorrow. So the War of 1812 was fought in this area between the British and the Americans. Most importantly, there was a battle on the evening of August 14th, 1814. At that time, the Americans held the fort and the British were planning a sneak attack. They came from the west side along the lake, and at that time also the fort was extended much to the west with different batteries, and the furthest west was Towson's battery. Um, Unfortunately, the Americans were waiting for them. They had inside knowledge that the British were coming, and the British forces, including Swiss and French people, um, were ill prepared for the battle, and they were massacred. Basically, it's one of the bloodiest battles in Canadian history. And this is just a depiction of what happened. You can see that the ladders they were using were too short. They had disarmed their firearms because they wanted to creep up on the Americans. And you can see the Americans standing over them, and they're quite easily. It was said they shot them like sheep. It was quite a terrible, terrible, bloody battle. And it became a gathering place of the dead. Many men were killed that night when they tried to attack Towson's battery. This is a battle that isn't often discussed. Um, no one really knows for sure how many men died. I've seen various reports, but there certainly have been over the years reports of human remains being found west of Snake Hill, which was quite close to Waverly Woods. Soon afterwards, it became a gathering place for freedom seekers. So escaped slaves would come across the river to freedom in Canada. And this is a snapshot of an 1851 census that shows that the escaped slaves found refuge at Waverly Woods in the old military barracks. So they're actually living on the site. In 1885, Snake Hill, which extended to Waverly Woods, became a place for Americans to gather for picnics. So they came across in ferries and other boats and had a picnic at Waverly Woods. And later on, a lot of amusement rides were added, the outdoor swimming pool, zoos, roller coasters, a dance hall, and much more. It was often called Erie Beach, Canada's Atlantic City. Unfortunately, it closed in 1930 due to the Depression. Remarkably, in 1905, the first meeting of the Niagara movement was held at Erie Beach Hotel, which is adjacent to the woods. So the members actually went into the woods and strolled around and relaxed in between meetings. And what is remarkable about this is that the Niagara movement later became the NWACP, the National Association of for the Advancement of Colored People. So quite the historic site in Canada. In more recent years, it's become a gathering place for the community. It's taken a pandemic to remind people how important being close to nature is for their well-being. And Waverly Woods has been a community treasure for decades and is part of our collective memories of life in Fort Erie. COVID has shown us the importance of inexpensive, easy, accessible wilderness and wild areas. Research has shown, many studies show that this kind of experience is critical for our well-being. And being able to walk in nature lowers our blood pressure and helps with our physical and mental well-being and provides, again, as Jay was mentioning, these costs to the community that are never assessed or included. Few years ago, I did a healthcare study that really brought this home to me. Um, we, I had a friend who was involved in healthcare, and we both worked at Brock, and we got some funding to conduct a 1 year study. And so, what my partner did was assess some residents at a long care unit that we had permission to do our study at. And um, she assessed them for wellness. And then I put up a bird feeder, several in fact, and we kept them stocked. And I did some shows for the residents, and we put up some, you can see the poster we put up, and we had some field guides. And much to our surprise, it was an enormous success. The residents loved it. They would fight that there was not enough wheelchair space. And the employees also loved it because their clients had something positive in their life that they really enjoyed. So it made their work much easier. And they offered in during the breaks and things to fill up some of the feeders, which was wonderful. The families in particular mentioned to me how nice it was to come and do something with their loved one, because after many long days and months in a facility like this, you kind of run out of things that are fun or interesting to do. And most importantly, I think for me, that gave me the warm fuzzies was that people in the locked in areas, their caregivers would take them to the window and use the bird feeders as calming techniques. So we can see, to me, that really hit home this really internal connection we have with nature and how important it is to our well being. So let's get back to the forest. Some of the trees in there go back to the War of 1812. And it's really important to know that these urban forests are quickly disappearing, leaving the community at a disadvantage to experience nature within walking or public transportation distance. So I'm not sure about the American side, but there's a big push to have walkable communities so that we don't need our cars, or we can take public transportation instead. The first time I went there, I'll never forget, because it was right after Hurricane Fran had gone through. And what happened was some really, really rare birds that are hardly ever seen in our area uh, ended up being blown into um, the Lake Erie right off of Waverly Woods. So the bird I saw there was a black cap petrel, but there were many other rare species, but that was certainly the rarest. It was pretty exciting, and it was in 1996, and I'll never forget that day. But now I discovered Waverly, so I was back and I walked in the woods, and I clearly remember going in there just awestruck. Even at that time, there were a few places in Niagara that compared to the beauty and and the number of bird species that I've seen in other areas. Um, so being there on migration day, like we saw at the beginning of the show, and this is the same day, is magical. Just listening to all the birds singing. And in fact, this year I was able to experience the birds actually, the birds fly at night. Most of the migratory birds fly at night. And this year I was actually able to experience on a foggy day, the birds actually dropping down into the woods, into the canopy of the woods at Waverly Woods. So that was really a special moment for me. Birds at Waverly have been documented for decades, and they're in a lot of the important books that were published on the US side about the Niagara Peninsula. This is a letter from someone thanking Dr. Harold Extell, who was the curator of vertebrate zoology at the Buffalo Museum of Science for 20 years and ended up in retirement living in Fort Erie. He thanked Dr. Extell for teaching him to identify fall warblers in the abandoned amusement park at Erie Beach. He wrote the letter in 1992 and thanked him for showing him the birds 40 years before that, before I was born, in fact. He said to Dr. Extell the experience was priceless in his memory, and that Dr. Extell contributed greatly to his life in the field of ornithology. eBird's been of great help with us in proving how valuable Waverly Woods is to birds. 225 species have been recorded on eBird. And I have to note that the number of bird watchers on eBird has increased by 30% since COVID began making it Waverly an important ecotourist destination as well, at least the potential for that. Up until last year, or 2 or 3 years ago, when the no trespassing signs went up, Waverly was was the third most important migratory stopover areas in Niagara, which means that thousands of birds were able to survive because they could stop on migration and refuel. Now some other places have taken it over because we haven't been able to get in there as much. And I just wanted to note the number two spot, which is the Grimsby Wetlands, which is an area much like Waverly that has been renaturalized and 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 made it into a bird watcher's paradise. And hundreds of people visit that area in migration and even all year round because it's so beautiful. But mostly for me, it's a gathering place for warblers. Warblers are my favorite groups of birds, and I just love them. And I look forward to May when I see them migrate through. Um, and I know that Waverly Woods is a highly significant spring migratory stopover location for many birds. And if they put a condo up, those birds will hit the condo at night because of the lights and they will be killed. So I estimate at least several thousand would have been killed this spring alone. This spring, we actually heard or saw 26 species of warblers from the adjacent public area. Who knows what was inside the woods? And they're just so beautiful, and we heard their songs, which are so lovely. But then that fateful day on October 31st, 2017, I'll never forget it. We actually cried when we saw the sign. We didn't realize that the property was even private or that anybody would be able to build on it because of the history and the importance to nature. But there you go, there's the plan. And you know what it looks like now and what it would look like after the development goes in. Well, I have to say, we weren't the only ones that were outraged. Many people were. The whole community was, the whole neighborhood for sure. And not only us, but people in Buffalo who regularly come over here as summer visitors or have properties here. people from all over Ontario actually got in touch with me because sometimes they'd been here for rare birds, or they got in touch with friends of mine because they've been here for the history. So there was multiple reasons for people to know and love Waverly Woods on an international basis. We formed an organization to oppose the development called Community Voices of Fort Erie. So what went wrong? Well, in the first place, the Indigenous community was not consulted as required by the Supreme Court of Canada. Um, Part of our group, Community Voices of Fort Erie, and others made over 20 presentations to town council outlining really solid reasons, scientific and scholarly, for not accepting the subdivision application. And in fact, we were highly complimented about our presentations. The town's own environmental assessment committee's recommendations were mostly not adopted. The museum's cultural heritage committee, which is the town's, was not consulted despite the overwhelming evidence of the historical and cultural significance. And the town's official plan was not applied in several ways. It was a very disappointing scenario for the community. And I've had many, many, many people tell me that. So what went wrong? Well, we've got a town where there's a lot of unemployment and poverty, and they're desperate for any kind of development, even if it is inappropriate. Uh, we had a rogue board of directors on our conservation authority that were pro-development, and things went so bad that the Auditor General of Ontario was called in, and they wrote a special audit of the MPCA, and it details in a lot of things that did go wrong at the time when the application for Waverly Woods and several other key areas in Niagara were going through the development process. One that sticks with me because I'm most familiar with it is the problems with the environmental impact study. Um, in the first place, the one for Waverly Woods ignored the presence of endangered species. And that's the whole point of doing an environmental impact study, is to assess the habitat and the species that use the area. There's a complete lack of mitigation for the endangered species and species at risk, which basically they just said, well, the habitat's gone, so the birds will be gone. And that was their mitigation, which was a little shocking. They blatantly said that a hydrology study was deemed not to be necessary, but uh, it's pretty obvious to anybody who's walked the property, especially after a storm event, that the connectivity with the provincially significant wetland across the road at the north end of the property, there is a lot of connectivity. A lot of water goes through that area. So I guess it kind of gets down to a problem with the planning process. Um, the entire north end of the property is designated by the region as an environmental conservation area, and it acts as a conduit between the Lake Erie shoreline and the Craft Drain wetland complex. So its function in terms of water is extremely important. Um, and the planning process requires that the environmental impact study needed to be produced and to discuss the connectivity. Um, the real big problem, I think, with this whole process is that the EIS is paid for by the developer, and he chooses the company that will do the EIS. And it, it, off, it obviously introduces a bias into the whole process. There is, however, a history of inappropriate development in Niagara, I have to say. We've heard of old growth forests being cut down because they interfere with development. We know that just down the road, human remains were found. That's outlined in a book called Death at Snake Hill. And in fact, 28 skeletons were found. Um, and it turned out they were American soldiers and buried in a graveyard uh, by the hospital that was installed in, in one of the barracks that had been extended from the fort. So they were going to throw those bones into the garbage, and they got caught. And so there was a big archaeology site established there, and they found all these skeletal remains. And it actually um, provided a lot of very valuable information about um, our history and the history of American soldiers. So it turned out it was quite a valuable find. Um, we often see there's in many of these developments, there's inaccurate information about endangered species and wetlands, um, and that the citizens and the local knowledge are being ignored completely in many of these projects, development projects. So what will we lose if Waverly Woods is developed? Well, some really special endangered species that migrate through there, like cerulean and golden wing warbler, which happens almost on an annual basis now, their ability to stop and refuel could cause them to die, and they wouldn't be able to make their migration because we've chipped away so much at these areas that we're down to the last few areas where they can actually refuel. And if they don't have these areas, they'll be lost. There's many special species that breed on the property, and it's most well known for the red-headed woodpecker, which is struggling, as we all know. It's endangered at the federal level. Um, but we also have some species at risk, like one of my favorite singers, the wood thrush and eastern wood pewee, breeding on the property. We also have endangered Fowler's toads, these poor little toads, which we can hear singing like sheep, are really special to me and several and many other people. But planners don't like them because they interfere with the development process. And just to remind everybody that you should have some experience handling these species because they're very sensitive. And what about bats and pollinators? It seems to me I thought they had to do some bat studies, and I didn't see any evidence of that. And of course, my monarchs use that area quite extensively. There's a lot of milkweed on there, and I know I've seen, you know, magical sites along the beach where there's hundreds of monarchs gathered in fall migration. And of course, we all know, the whole community knows the impact of climate change and Waverly Woods. We've seen our beloved bike path and friendship trail destroyed in several storms. And so it also brings to mind, well, what is the 100-year flood mark now? And, uh, and is there going to be any mitigation for further damage? But another thing really worries me, and that's flood mitigation. So if you've got all this connectivity with a provincially significant wetland and there's a lot of water on the property, um, what happens to the homeowners who buy on that property or their adjacent homeowners when they get flooded basements, which they're most likely to have happen? It's a swamp. Um, there's a lot of water there. So, well, I guess maybe insurance might pay for it, but in that sense, we all pay. Um, but also, it's important to note that for some postal codes in Fort Erie, residents can no longer buy insurance for flooded basements. So I don't know if they can determine that ahead of time for properties like this. I no idea. I can tell you that almost 7,600 people have signed our petition, and that's how we keep everybody up to date about what's happening with Waverly. So if you want to help, please sign our petition and we'll keep in touch with you. Um, the other thing for local people, but I think this is true of anybody, is you need to always let your politicians know what you want. If they don't know how you feel about nature or development or inappropriate development, um, or your community, then they can't respond when issues come up. It, we all need to realize that we have a role in this, and we need to, as we could see on the Buffalo side, that people rally and get out there and voice their opinions. So we need to all do this and stand up for what we want in our communities. So what happens if we don't make our voice heard? Well, I think we understand in Ontario, especially Southern Ontario now, that there's a huge push to develop and to develop completely. And if anybody's driven by Grimsby, you know what I mean. Along the lake there, it's a sterile environment with no trees and just pavement. And so we need to each individually decide, do we want a natural heritage framework work in place in Niagara before we lose everything, which we are really on the verge of having that happen. So it's important that you, especially now, vote, comment on the upcoming changes to the Niagara Region official plan. They're in the process of updating it to be in line with what the province has just put down on the table. Um, so you need to tell your politicians, uh, so your mayors all sit on the regional council as well as your regional reps. You need to tell them that we need a better natural heritage system that's being than that is than the one that is currently being proposed. We need something strong, something ironclad, so that the developers can't just show up and say, "Oh no, we really need to develop there, so just let us." Okay, no, we need it to be ironclad so that they can't keep chipping away at what little we have left. And the same goes for our water. So I'm going to end my talk with an experience I had several years ago, um, when I was when I come to a point when I have to make a decision about Waverly and where to go next, and after consulting with my colleagues on our community voices, I often just walk over to the woods and just stand there and hope I get some inspiration. And one day when that was happening, I began a conversation with an Indigenous lady and her daughter, and she was telling me that she was on a spiritual quest and she'd come to the woods, um, because it was a sacred place for her and she wanted to show her daughter. And I was really, touched by her story. And then she said, "Wait a minute, I have something for you." And she went back to her car and she came back with this. And she said, "Well, when I was making this, the spirits told me that I should gift this to somebody." And she said, I want you to have it. And it was quite an emotional moment for me because um, I knew she was on this spiritual quest and that I'd become a part of it, and Waverly Woods had become a part of it. And so I really appreciated that. So thank you, Jay, for having uh, working with me on this. It's been a great experience, and we're just going to keep doing our best to make nature come first.
Wow, Marcie, that was a really wonderful presentation. And I know that Waverly Woods is one of the most endangered places in the Niagara River corridor, if not in the Great Lakes. And it's so important that you're doing the work that you're doing there. When I first came to this area over 50 years ago, crossed the bridge from Buffalo. I live in the US. One of the first places I went to was Waverly Beach, Waverly Woods, Erie Beach. And I've been going back there for all these years and just watching it change, and watching development happen there. And it's been shocking and sad because the natural history there is so important. And the history, the human history. I mean, you talked about the Niagara movement, and the NAACP founding there. This place should be a cultural park that's green and natural and all the war history. So I really appreciate this presentation. I want people to know we have a page on our website that's Waverly Beach page, so people can get information there, including your petition and other stuff. And if you want to keep updated, go to our website, birdsoftheniagara.org. Marcie, it was great having you here tonight, and thanks so much.
Thanks, Jay. Somehow we did it.
Everyone, we have a lot of programs on Birds of the Niagara. You can go to our website and see them. There's over a dozen different programs, and they're going to be broadcast at a regular schedule during February 12th, 13th, and 14th, but they'll also be archived on the site, so you don't have to be there at the exact schedule time. You can see them over and over again for probably at least the next year. So thanks for coming to visit us tonight, and we'll keep fighting for this stuff.